First scene, Chapter 3 of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda McDaniel. No Name by Wilkie Collins. First scene, Chapter 3. When she got back to the house, Miss Garth made no attempt to conceal her unfavorable opinion of the stranger in black. His object was no doubt to obtain pecuniary assistance from Mrs. Vanstone. What the nature of his claim on her might be seemed less intelligible, unless it was the claim of a poor relation. Had Mrs. Vanstone ever mentioned, in the presence of her daughters, the name of Captain Wragge? Neither of them recollected to have heard it before. Had Mrs. Vanstone ever referred to any poor relations who were dependent on her? On the contrary, she had mentioned of late years that she doubted having any relations at all who were still living. And yet Captain Wragge had plainly declared that the name on his card would recall a family matter to Mrs. Vanstone's memory. What did it mean? A false statement on the stranger's part, without any intelligible reason for making it, or a second mystery, following close on the heels of the mysterious journey to London? All the probabilities seemed to point to some hidden connection between the family affairs, which had taken Mr. and Mrs. Vanstone so suddenly from home, and the family matter associated with the name of Captain Wragge. Miss Garth's doubts thronged back irresistibly on her mind as she sealed her letter to Mrs. Vanstone, with the captain's card added by way of enclosure. By return of post the answer arrived. Always the earliest riser among the ladies in the house, Miss Garth was alone in the breakfast-room when the letter was brought in. Her first glance at its contents convinced her of the necessity of reading it carefully through in retirement, before any embarrassing questions could be put to her. Leaving a message with the servant requesting Nora to make the tea that morning, she went upstairs at once to the solitude and security of her own room. Mrs. Vanstone's letter extended to some length. The first part of it referred to Captain Wragge, and entered unreservedly into all necessary explanations related to the man himself and to the motive which had brought him to Combe Raven. It appeared from Mrs. Vanstone's statement that her mother had been twice married. Her mother's first husband had been a certain Dr. Wragge, a widower with young children, and one of those children was now the unmilitary-looking captain, whose address was Post Office, Bristol. Mrs. Wragge had left no family by her first husband, and had afterward married Mrs. Vanstone's father. Of that second marriage, Mrs. Vanstone herself was the only issue. She had lost both her parents while she was still a young woman, and in course of years her mother's family connections, who were then her nearest surviving relatives, had been one after another removed by death. She was left at the present writing without a relation in the world, excepting, perhaps, certain cousins whom she had never seen, and of whose existence, even at the present moment, she possessed no positive knowledge. Under these circumstances, what family claim had Captain Wragge on Mrs. Vanstone? None whatever. As the son of her mother's first husband, by that husband's first wife, not even the widest stretch of courtesy could have included him at any time in the list of Mrs. Vanstone's most distant relations. Well, knowing this, the letter proceeded to say, he had nevertheless persisted in forcing himself upon her as a species of family connection, and she had weakly sanctioned the intrusion, solely from the dread that he would otherwise introduce himself to Mr. Vanstone's notice and take unblushing advantage of Mr. Vanstone's generosity. Shrinking naturally from allowing her husband to be annoyed, and probably cheated as well, by any person who claimed, however preposterously, a family connection with herself, it had been her practice for many years past to assist the captain from her own purse, on the condition that he should never come near the house, and that he should not presume to make any application whatever to Mr. Vanstone. Readily admitting the imprudence of this course, Mrs. Vanstone further explained that she had perhaps been the more inclined to adopt it through having always been accustomed, in her early days, to see the captain living now upon one member and now upon another of her mother's family. Possessed of abilities which might have raised him to distinction in almost any career that he could have chosen, he had nevertheless from his youth upward been a disgrace to all his relatives. He had been expelled from the militia regiment in which he once held a commission. He had tried one employment after another, and had discreditably failed in all. He had lived on his wits, in the lowest and basest meaning of the phrase. He had married a poor ignorant woman, who had served as a waitress at some low eating-house, who had unexpectedly come into a little money, and whose small inheritance he had mercilessly squandered to the last farthing. In plain terms, he was an incorrigible scoundrel, and he had now added one more to the list of his many misdemeanours by impudently breaking the conditions on which Mrs. Vanstone had hitherto assisted him. She had written at once to the address indicated on his card, in such terms and to such purpose as would prevent him, she hoped and believed, from ever venturing near the house again. Such were the terms in which Mrs. Vanstone concluded that first part of her letter which referred exclusively to Captain Wragge. Although the statement thus presented implied a weakness in Mrs. Vanstone's character, which Miss Garth, after many years of intimate experience, had never detected, she accepted the explanation as a matter of course, receiving it all the more readily inasmuch as it might, without impropriety, be communicated in substance to appease the irritated curiosity of the two young ladies. For this reason especially she perused the first half of the letter with an agreeable sense of relief. Far different was the impression produced on her when she advanced to the second half, and when she had read it to the end. The second part of the letter was devoted to the subject of the journey to London. Mrs. Vanstone began by referring to the long and intimate friendship which had existed between Miss Garth and herself. She now felt it due to that friendship to explain confidentially the motive which had induced her to leave home with her husband. Miss Garth had delicately refrained from showing it, but she must naturally have felt, and must still be feeling, great surprise at the mystery in which their departure had been involved, and she must doubtless have asked herself why Mrs. Vanstone should have associated with family affairs which, in her independent position as to relatives, must necessarily concern Mr. Vanstone alone. Without touching on those affairs, which it was neither desirable nor necessary to do, Mrs. Vanstone then proceeded to say that she would at once set all Miss Garth's doubts at rest, so far as they related to herself, by one plain acknowledgment. Her object in accompanying her husband to London was to see a certain celebrated physician, and to consult him privately on a very delicate and anxious matter connected with the state of her health. In plainer terms still, this anxious matter meant nothing less than the possibility that she might again become a mother. When the doubt had first suggested itself, she had treated it as a mere delusion. The long interval that had elapsed since the birth of her last child, the serious illness which had afflicted her after the death of that child in infancy, the time of life at which she had now arrived, all inclined her to dismiss the idea as soon as it arose in her mind. It had returned again and again in spite of her. She had felt the necessity of consulting the highest medical authority, and had shrunk at the same time from alarming her daughters by summoning a London physician to the house. The medical opinion, sought under the circumstances already mentioned, had now been obtained. Her doubt was confirmed as a certainty, and the result, which might be expected to take place toward the end of the summer, was, at her age, and with her constitutional peculiarities, a subject for serious future anxiety, to say the least of it. The physician had done his best to encourage her, but she had understood the drift of his questions more clearly than he supposed, and she knew that he looked to the future with more than ordinary doubt. Having disclosed these particulars, Mrs. Vanstone requested that they might be kept a secret between her correspondent and herself. She had felt unwilling to mention her suspicions to Miss Garth until those suspicions had been confirmed, and she now recoiled, with even greater reluctance, from allowing her daughters to be in any way alarmed about her. It would be best to dismiss the subject for the present, and to wait hopefully till the summer came. In the meantime they would all, she trusted, be happily reunited on the 23rd of the month, which Mr. Vanstone had fixed as to the day for their return. With this intimation, and with the customary messages, the letter abruptly and confusedly came to an end. For the first few minutes a natural sympathy for Mrs. Vanstone was the only feeling of which Miss Garth was conscious after she had laid the letter down. Ere long, however, there rose obscurely in her mind a doubt which perplexed and distressed her. Was the explanation which she had just read really as satisfactory and as complete as it professed to be? Testing it plainly by facts, surely not. On the morning of her departure, Mrs. Vanstone had unquestionably left the house in good spirits. In her age and in her state of health, were good spirits compatible with such an errand to a physician as the errand on which she was bent? Then again, had that letter from New Orleans, which had necessitated Mr. Vanstone's departure, no share in occasioning his wife's departure as well? Why, otherwise, had she looked up so eagerly the moment her daughter mentioned the postmark? Granting the avowed motive for her journey, did not her manner on the morning when the letter was opened, and again on the morning of departure, suggest the existence of some other motive which her letter kept concealed? If it was so, the conclusion that followed was a very distressing one. Mrs. Vanstone, feeling what was due to her long friendship with Miss Garth, had apparently placed the fullest confidence in her on one subject, by way of unsuspiciously maintaining the strictest reserve toward her on another. Naturally frank and straightforward in all her own dealings, Miss Garth shrank from plainly pursuing her doubts to this result. A want of loyalty toward her tried and valued friend seemed implied in the mere dawning of it in her mind. She locked up the letter in her desk, roused herself resolutely to attend to the passing interests of the day, and went downstairs again to the breakfast-room. Amid many uncertainties, this at least was clear: Mr. and Mrs. Vanstone were coming back on the 23rd of the month. Who could say what new revelations might not come back with them? End of Chapter 3. Recording by Linda McDaniel, August 2009.